The claim that the Society of St. Pius VI fell into schism when it consecrated bishops without a papal mandate rests on a legal assumption that Bishop Athanasius Schneider has now directly challenged. According to a statement he issued, and which was published by the Vatican journalist Diane Montagna, formal schism is not established simply by the act of consecrating a bishop against the discipline of the moment. Schneider, the traditionalist auxiliary bishop of Astana in Kazakhstan, argues that schism in the proper canonical and theological sense requires something far graver than disobedience to a disciplinary norm. It requires what he calls a rejection in principle of papal authority itself, a formal contempt for the office of Peter, expressed concretely through the erection of a rival hierarchy that sets itself up as a parallel church. And that, he contends, the Society of St. Pius X has never done. His reasoning here matters because Bishop Schneider is not an outside commentator. He was the Vatican's own visitor to the Society, sent to observe its houses and seminaries, and so he speaks with a familiarity that few of his rank possess. He points to a fact that is often overlooked in the heat of the controversy. The priests of the Society name the reigning pontiff in the canon of every Mass they offer, and they publicly affirm that he is the Pope. This is not a small liturgical detail. In the ancient discipline of the Church, to name the Pope in the canon is precisely the act by which a local community declares its communion with the See of Rome. A body that intended to break from the Pope would remove his name. The Society retains it. For Schneider, this single persistent practice is evidence that the will to remain within the Church has never been abandoned, however irregular the canonical situation may appear from the outside. If you find this kind of careful examination of the Church's teaching valuable, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss what follows. To understand why this distinction carries weight, one has to grasp the difference Schneider draws between two kinds of law within the Church, a distinction that reaches back to the classical tradition of Catholic theology. There is divine law, which is revealed by God and which the Church has no power to alter, and there is human ecclesiastical law, the disciplinary framework that the Church herself establishes and which she can and does change across the centuries. The requirement that a bishop be consecrated only with a papal mandate belongs, Schneider observes, to this second category. It is a matter of discipline, not of divine institution. And here he introduces a historical observation that unsettles the assumption that consecration without papal approval is inherently an act of rupture. For much of the Church's first millennium, bishops were consecrated throughout the Christian world, without the direct involvement of the Bishop of Rome. The development that made a pontifical mandate a universal requirement for the validity of the act, or more precisely for its laicity, emerged only in the second millennium. The point is not that the modern discipline is wrong, but that it is discipline, historically conditioned and therefore not to be treated as though it belonged to the unchangeable deposit of faith. From this foundation, Schneider identifies what he regards as two distortions that have shaped the way Rome has handled cases like this one. The first he calls legalism, by which he means the treatment of the legal dimension of the Church as though it were a near absolute, as though the observance of a canonical norm could take precedence over every other consideration, including fidelity to the faith itself. The second he names papalism, the over-exaggeration or absolutizing of the papal office and of the obedience owed to it, as though obedience to the Pope in every disciplinary matter were itself a dogma of the faith. Both of these, in his analysis, invert the true order. The law exists to serve the salvation of souls and the handing on of the faith. It is not an end in itself, and the papacy, august as it is, exists to guard and transmit the revealed deposit, not to stand above it. When either the law or the office is absolutized, the very purpose each was meant to serve can be obscured. It is worth pausing here because these are not reckless assertions. Schneider grounds them in the constant teaching of the Church that positive human law binds ordinarily but admits of rare and extraordinary exceptions. He writes that there exist circumstances, uncommon and grave, in which a Catholic is bound in conscience to act against positive human law precisely in order to remain faithful to divine law. This is not a novel or radical principle. It is embedded in the moral tradition of the Church, which has always taught that no human law can oblige a person to act against the higher law of God. The whole weight of Schneider's argument turns on whether the present situation is one of those genuinely extraordinary cases, and that is a judgment about which faithful Catholics may reasonably differ. But the principle itself, that human ecclesiastical law is not absolute, and that conscience formed by the faith retains its claims, is thoroughly Catholic. To make the point that such conflicts are not unthinkable, Schneider reaches into the history of the papacy itself and draws on the case of Pope Honorius I. Honorius, in the 7th century, appeared in his ordinary correspondence to lend support to the Monothelite heresy, the teaching that Christ possessed only one will rather than both a divine and a human will. He was subsequently condemned, and this is the striking part, by 3 ecumenical councils, beginning with the Third Council of Constantinople. The Church herself, in her most solemn conciliar acts, censured a pope for a failure touching the faith. Schneider's point in raising this is not to diminish the papacy, but to establish, from the Church's own record, that a tension between obedience to the reigning pontiff and fidelity to the deposit of faith is not a theological impossibility. It has happened. The tradition contains it. And if it can happen, then the mere fact of a disagreement with Rome cannot by itself constitute the sin of schism, for schism is defined by the rejection of the papal office as such, not by a conflict over a particular exercise of it. Having laid this groundwork, Schneider frames the position of the Society of St. Pius X as a genuine dilemma, rather than as simple rebellion. As he presents it, the Society is caught between 2 paths, neither of which is comfortable. On one path, it submits fully, and in doing so accepts elements of doctrine and liturgy that it regards as unclear or ambiguous. On the other, it disobeys in a grave matter, the consecration of bishops, in order to secure the continued handing on of the faith as it has received it. Schneider does not pretend this dilemma is easily resolved. He locates its deepest root not in the stubbornness of the society, but in what he calls the objective ambiguities of certain statements of the Second Vatican Council, singling out particularly its teaching on ecumenism and on interreligious dialogue. Whether one agrees with that assessment or not, it is an argument about texts and their interpretation, a properly theological argument, and it deserves to be engaged as such rather than dismissed. And it is precisely this kind of measured, source-based examination that this channel exists to offer, which is why your subscription and your engagement in the comments genuinely help. The most consequential part of the statement comes at its conclusion, where Schneider moves from defense to request. He asks the Holy See itself to acknowledge these ambiguities, both in the conciliar texts and in the rite of the new Mass, the Novus Ordo. This is a remarkable step, because it reframes the entire controversy. Rather than treating the society as the sole party in need of correction, Schneider suggests that a path toward genuine reconciliation would involve Rome addressing the very ambiguities that gave rise to the crisis in the first place. It is a call for clarification rather than condemnation, for dialogue that takes the theological substance seriously. One must be careful here to represent the state of the question honestly. As of now, there has been no clarification from the Holy See regarding the canonical problems raised about the consecrations, and no meeting has taken place between the Society and the Pope. The situation remains genuinely open, and Schneider's statement is an intervention within an ongoing and unresolved dispute, not the final word upon it. What gives this intervention its particular force is the man behind it. Schneider is not a schismatic himself, nor a figure operating at the fringes. He is a bishop in full communion with Rome, a man who has served the Holy See as its own delegated visitor to the society he is now defending. When such a figure states plainly that there was no schism, and grounds that judgment in the distinction between divine and human law, in the historical record of episcopal consecration, in the precedent of Honorius, and in the perennial moral principle that conscience bound to the faith may, in extraordinary cases, resist positive law, he is not offering an opinion lightly. He is making a theological argument that asks to be weighed on its merits. Whether Rome will respond, and how, remains to be seen. The Vatican may react to the substance of what he has said, or it may react to the bishop himself for having said it. Neither outcome can be predicted with confidence, and it would be irresponsible to pretend otherwise. The distinction between what belongs to divine law and what belongs to human ecclesiastical law is one of the foundations of Catholic theology, and understanding it clarifies a great deal about how the Church governs herself and why certain things can change while others never will. Divine law is what God has revealed and established, whether through the natural order inscribed in creation or through the supernatural revelation given in Scripture and tradition. The Church receives this law, she does not author it, and she has no authority to alter it. The truth that Christ is true God and true man, that there are 7 sacraments, that marriage between the baptized is indissoluble, that the Eucharist is the true body and blood of the Lord, these belong to the deposit of faith and stand outside the reach of any human power to change. Human ecclesiastical law, by contrast, is the body of discipline the Church establishes to order her life in a given age. The rules governing fasting, the ages required for various offices, the procedures of canonical trials, the specific requirements surrounding the ordination and consecration of ministers, these the Church has made, and these she can, and historically does, modify. The Code of Canon Law itself, promulgated in its current Latin form in 1983, is precisely such a body of changeable discipline, and it has been revised before and can be revised again. This distinction is not an invention of recent controversy, but reaches back through the entire tradition of Catholic moral and canonical thought. St. Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologiae, treats human law as a genuine participation in the order of reason directed toward the common good, binding in conscience precisely because, and insofar as it serves that good, while divine and natural law possess an authority that no human legislator can touch. The classical principle that flows from this is that human law binds ordinarily but not absolutely. A just law of the Church obliges the faithful, and obedience to legitimate authority is itself a Christian virtue rooted in humility and in the recognition that Christ governs his Church through visible shepherds. Yet the same tradition has always held that no merely human law can oblige a person to act against the higher law of God. This is why St. Peter and the Apostles could declare before the Sanhedrin, as recorded in the Acts of the Apostles, that one must obey God rather than men. The principle does not license private judgment run wild. It identifies the narrow and grave circumstances in which fidelity to divine law must take precedence over a human precept that would contradict it. The nature of schism, properly understood, is likewise more precise than common usage suggests. The Code of Canon Law, in Canon 751, defines schism as the refusal of submission to the Roman pontiff, or of communion with the members of the Church subject to him. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, in paragraph 2089, echoes this, distinguishing schism from heresy and apostasy. Heresy is the obstinate denial or doubt of a truth that must be believed with divine and Catholic faith. Apostasy is the total repudiation of the Christian faith. Schism is the rupture of the bond of unity and obedience with the Pope and the Church. What the tradition emphasizes is that schism in the formal and proper sense involves a rejection of the principle of papal authority itself, a refusal of communion as such, rather than a disagreement, however serious, over the exercise of that authority in a particular matter. This is why the Church has always been careful to distinguish between disobedience, even grave disobedience, and the sin of schism. A person may sin gravely against obedience without thereby denying that the Pope is the Pope, or that he possesses the authority Christ gave to Peter. The two are not identical, and the moral and canonical tradition insists on keeping them distinct. The case of Pope Honorius I belongs to this same body of Catholic knowledge and is instructive precisely because the Church herself has never hidden it. In the 7th century, Honorius, in private correspondence concerning the monothelite controversy, expressed himself in a way that seemed to favor the erroneous position that Christ possessed only a single will, rather than the two wills, divine and human, that correspond to his two natures. After his death, the Third Council of Constantinople in 681 condemned him, and subsequent councils confirmed that censure. The Church has always understood this episode in light of the doctrine of papal infallibility, as it was later defined at the First Vatican Council in 1870. That definition is carefully limited. The Pope teaches infallibly only when he speaks ex cathedra, that is, when, as supreme pastor, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole Church. The case of Honorius, involving private letters and not a solemn definition, falls entirely outside the scope of infallibility and in no way contradicts it. Understanding this protects the faithful from two opposite errors: the error of imagining that the Pope can never err in any capacity, and the error of concluding from a single historical failure that the papal office lacks the protection Christ promised it. The historical development of the discipline surrounding episcopal consecration is another matter that belongs to sound Catholic knowledge. The episcopate is of divine institution. The Church has always held that bishops are the successors of the apostles, and that the fullness of the sacrament of holy orders is conferred through episcopal consecration. This is unchangeable, but the specific disciplinary requirement that a bishop be consecrated only with a mandate from the Roman pontiff developed over time and became a universal norm of the Latin Church, especially in the second millennium. In the present law, Canon 1382 attaches the penalty of excommunication both to a bishop who consecrates someone a bishop without a pontifical mandate and to the one who receives consecration in that circumstance. This is a real and serious penalty, and the Church imposes it to safeguard the unity of the episcopate in its communion with the See of Peter. Yet it remains a disciplinary and penal norm rather than a matter of divine law, and the history of the Church shows that the relationship between the local conferral of orders and the direct involvement of Rome has not always taken the exact form it holds today. Canon law also provides a framework for understanding how penalties operate and how personal culpability is assessed, and this too is part of the Church's wisdom. The tradition distinguishes between the objective violation of a law and the subjective guilt of the person who violates it. Canon 1323 lists circumstances in which a person is not subject to a penalty, including a case in which someone acted, without grave fault, out of a mistaken belief that circumstances of necessity were present. Canon 1324 addresses situations of diminished culpability. These provisions exist because the Church, as a mother, is concerned not merely with the external act, but with the state of the soul, and she has always refused to reduce moral responsibility to a mechanical application of rules. This is the deeper meaning of the ancient axiom that the salvation of souls is the supreme law of the Church, a principle expressed in the very last canon of the Code. Law in the Church is not an end in itself. It is ordered to the good of souls and to the handing on of the faith. It is precisely here that the Church warns against two distortions that can arise when this ordering is forgotten. The first is a kind of legalism in which the observance of external norms is treated as though it were the whole of the Christian life, or as though the letter of the law could take precedence over the salvation it exists to serve. Our Lord himself confronted this tendency in the Gospel when he taught that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, as recorded by St. Mark. The second distortion concerns the right understanding of the papacy. The First Vatican Council, in defining papal primacy and infallibility, was careful to specify their limits precisely so that they would not be exaggerated. The Pope is the guardian and servant of the deposit of faith, not its master. His authority exists to hand on faithfully what has been received, and the councils that defined his prerogatives took pains to root them in the mission entrusted to Peter to strengthen his brethren in the faith. A right filial love for the papacy honors both its dignity and its purpose, neither diminishing the office nor absolutizing it beyond what the Church herself teaches. The Catechism offers positive guidance for the faithful who find themselves troubled by tensions and divisions within the Church. And this pastoral dimension deserves emphasis. Paragraph 2089 places schism among the offenses against the unity for which Christ prayed at the Last Supper when he asked that all might be one. Unity is not incidental to the Church. It is a mark of her very nature, professed in the Creed when we confess one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. The faithful are therefore called to labor and pray for the healing of divisions, rather than to take them lightly or to widen them. At the same time, the Church encourages a genuine and reverent attachment to the liturgical and doctrinal patrimony she has received across the centuries. The Second Vatican Council, in its Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, taught that the liturgy is the summit toward which the activity of the Church is directed, and the font from which her power flows, and it called for reform to be undertaken with care and continuity rather than rupture. A love for the tradition and a desire for its integrity are not in themselves contrary to communion. The whole art of Catholic fidelity lies in holding love of the tradition and love of unity together. For the individual believer, several settled principles can guide reflection on matters of this kind. The first is that the Pope is truly the successor of Peter and the visible principle of unity in the Church, and that no private judgment may set itself up as a rival magisterium. The second is that obedience to legitimate authority is a real virtue, to be practiced with humility and trust, and that the ordinary path of Catholic life is one of docility rather than resistance. The third is that the deposit of faith is unchangeable, and that fidelity to it is the measure against which everything else is weighed, since the very purpose of authority and law in the Church is to guard and transmit that deposit. The fourth is that the Church draws careful distinctions between divine and human law, between disobedience and schism, between the objective act and subjective culpability, and that these distinctions are not evasions, but expressions of her concern for truth and for souls. When questions arise that the magisterium has not definitively resolved, the faithful are free to hold and discuss differing views with charity, provided they do so within the communion of the Church and with respect for her authority. Above all, the tradition counsels prayer for the unity of the Church, for the Holy Father, and for the healing of every division, entrusting to God what exceeds human power to resolve and remaining always within the one body of Christ, where the fullness of the means of salvation is found. What can be said is that this statement invites every thoughtful Catholic to reflect more deeply on questions that are too often reduced to slogans: what schism truly is and is not, how the Church distinguishes what can change from what cannot, and how obedience and fidelity relate to one another when they seem to pull in different directions. These are not questions with easy answers, and the Church's own tradition, as Schneider shows, is richer and more textured than the headlines suggest. If this examination has helped you understand the matter more clearly, consider subscribing and sharing it with others who value the faith explored with reverence and care. Thank you sincerely for watching, for thinking through these difficult questions with an open and faithful heart, and for the time you have given to this reflection.